Once a month, when the moon reaches its highest point in the sky and the wild creatures call out to the night, he emerges from a private sanctuary in an undisclosed location outside of Little Rock, Arkansas. Arrayed in his priestly vestments, carrying forth the good news that comic books and graphic novels aren't just for kids, that they aren't just mass and spandex superheroes, that storytelling in a graphic format can be so much more. He is the graphic novel apostle.
Hello and welcome back to the Graphic Novel Apostle podcast. I'm your host, Mark Orenberger. I'm so happy to be here with you on this Monday morning, as always. Before we get started this week, I want to say a quick thank you to my guest from last week, Sean Golding, where we talked about his book, Guns of Brixton. A little bit of punk rock, a little bit of zombies, a whole lot of fun. And the week before, when we really kicked off our horror story series for this Halloween with my buddy Parrish Pollard, and we talked about Bone Parish Volume 1, also written by Cullen Bunn, who is the writer of our book today. And we'll get into it. We're going to do a book called Midnite Show today. But first, I want to introduce to you my guest. He is my longtime friend, my former colleague from the Arkansas Attorney General's office, the gentleman from Woodruff County himself, Mr. Jake Jones. Jake, how are you, man?
I'm doing well,
Good. Jake, I had to have you on in October. I knew this from before I ever started this podcast because if there is anyone who embodies the spirit of Halloween that I know in my life, it is one Jake Jones, and he's looking me in the eye right now. Jake, have you already got the feeling?
I do. The weather's cooled off a little bit. Decorations are starting to go up around town. The days are getting shorter. So yeah, and it's October. I'm full on, spooky season.
I was putting Garrett to bed last night, and he's got a lava lamp in his room that's like a white lava lamp, and sometimes we'll leave that on at night just kind of for effect. But recently, we have strung up some LED lights that he got in a church bingo prize, basically, and it's a set of purple and a set of orange. And last night, he wanted me to put those on over his bed instead of the lava lamp, and it was perfect Halloween feel. I was so happy walking out of that kid's room, like, you're feeling Halloween even in your sleep.
Passing it on to the next generation.
I've made no shortage of telling people about this over and over again. I love Halloween. It's my favorite. And that's one of the things we've bonded on over the years.
Certainly, yeah. And a bond that won't break. I mean, I realized from the start when we first, because some people are just like, Halloween, no big deal. I like Christmas better. But, from the very beginning, I was like, here's a kindred spirit in Mark who appreciates the spooky season.
For sure. We are going to spend a few minutes talking all about Halloween and some of your awesome Halloween traditions that have been important to me over the years, that have really helped kind of keep that spirit alive for me. But let me run through the credits on this book first. So this book is called Midnite Show, and that's Midnite, so the alternate version of Midnite. It was written by author Cullen Bunn. Art was done by Brian Hurtt, with colors by Bill Crabtree. Letters were done by Jim Campbell, and this was published by Dark Horse Comics. This came out as a 4-issue miniseries that started in October of last year. So issue 1 of this book I was picking up off the stands and was really helping me to kick off my Halloween season just right. Although, because it was a book that came out monthly, it ran through January of this year. So it was kind of funny at Christmas time when I was still reading about, horror monsters and stuff. But, I welcome it year round. And so to get ready for this episode, I read the individual issues, reread them, and you read a copy of the trade paperback that collected all of those, and that came out right after the series concluded. But I also want to note, this same writer-artist color team has done a couple of other books together that have been pretty big hits, and one that is among my very favorite comics of all, and that is called The Damned. I've been holding off on doing that. It's a little bit like, Jake, I know you're a Coen Brothers guy like I am. The Damned is basically Miller's Crossing, but with demons.
Wow.
I love it. I love it. And it's coming out next month in a great big hardback omnibus edition that's going to collect the whole series, and I've got it on my wish list already.
Well, yeah.
Can't wait for that.
I intend to read that.
And then at least Cullen Bunn and Brian Hurtt did a series called The Sixth Gun that was a Western with some magic and supernatural elements to it as well that was really fun. I can't remember it off the top of my head whether Bill Crabtree was part of that as the color artist, but either way, this is a team that I always get excited for, and they delivered with this one. What I want to read just quickly is the solicit that appears on the back of the trade paperback to give listeners an idea of what this story is. It reads, Basil Saxon is a legend among horror fans. Over 50 years ago, he vanished during a freak accident on the set of the film that would have been his masterpiece. The cursed film, God of Monsters, was never completed and has never been seen. But when a film festival shows footage from the long-lost movie, classic horror monsters manifest to wreak havoc and terror on the unsuspecting populace. A ragtag group of misfits must band together to stop the most famous creatures of all time and send them back to the realm of celluloid nightmares. Jake, what did you think of this book?
It was fun. The art was great, and it focused on the universal movie monsters, in a fun and different setting that you hadn't seen them in, but it called back to, a lot of that history, and it was fun to see these monsters in action.
Yeah, and I should say for listeners that the monsters we're going to be talking about in here are the universal movie monsters. So Count Dracula, a werewolf, except this one is the Necro Wolf.
Yeah.
He's been bitten by a vampire.
Yeah, a werewolf with vampirism.
Yeah. Frankenstein's monster, except this one actually has the brain of the mad scientist creator Frankenstein transferred into the monster. And because the scientist's brain is in the monster, I think we can safely just call him Frankenstein without people correcting us. So thanks to our creative team for that. And then we have a mummy who goes by the name Amon Razar. What would be the creature from the Black Lagoon?
The Dweller. The
Dweller. He's called the Inhuman one time in here, or referred to more often as the Dweller. This is the Fishman with razor-sharp teeth. And I'm going to tell you right now, even though at my deepest of hearts I am a vampire guy, in this book, the superstar for me is the Dweller.
Oh, yeah. And I liked the character model in this because, in the old creature from the Black Lagoon from the 50s, he's kind of fish-faced, looking, but this guy had razor-sharp teeth and he was biting faces, and that was scary. That was fun. That was a fun character model.
Razor-sharp teeth with his gums like all pulled back, and so you're seeing, or his lips, I guess, all pulled back, so you're seeing gums and teeth every time he comes on the screen, and he is the most terrifying. This movie harkens back in some ways, but it's a very different take on it, the movie Monster Squad. Yeah. Are you familiar with that movie?
Yeah.
Okay.
Monster Squad's great.
Look, I tell people that I am a horror fan, and of course I talk about how much I love Halloween, and I had never seen all of Monster Squad until this week.
Oh, all right.
And I was like, Jake's going to embarrass me if I come over here and I've never seen, he comes over here and I've never seen Monster Squad. In Monster Squad, you've got one of these movies where all of the universal monsters come and descend on a small town. And in that case, it's like elementary school kids who have to band together, who are, sort of social misfits in their class that have to get together and figure out a way to defeat these monsters. We get some different elements here. Of course, it's not kids, it's all adults, maybe late teenagers who are involved in this book. But you also have some different dynamics between the monsters themselves that make this a whole lot more fun.
Yeah, I liked sort of the fellowship of monster hunters that formed, here. So you had the boyfriend and the girlfriend, and the boyfriend was a big horror movie fan. That's why they were at the film festival seeing this God of Monsters movie. And then you have the theater workers, that get caught up in it. And then you've got the old, Scream Queen who'd been, signing autographs in the lobby, and they're all thrown together to combat these monsters.
So I texted our mutual friend Michael Crump yesterday, and I told him that you were coming over today, and we're going to do this episode with me, and how much you're a Halloween guy, which he already knew. And he wrote back, he's David S. Pumpkins. Now, I didn't know what that was, and so I was like, I don't know. Apparently, it was from an SNL sketch from a couple of years ago, and I was like, well, I suppose if you had to have a name for a man who loves Halloween this much, that would be it. So, Jake, when this season starts to roll around, you go quiet on Facebook for long periods of time, but I usually know the Halloween season is upon us because the background images on your Facebook page, they start turning to some classic Halloween stuff. You want to tell me about some of those?
Yeah, so one of them is an old library poster, and it says October is a good time to read, and it's got a man sitting in a chair, and he's reading a scary book, and his hair's standing on end, and it's very comic-like. Mm-hmm. And there's ghosts swirling around him, and bad guys, and so that's. It says October's bright blue weather is a great time to read. So I love that. Then the other is a cover of a Halloween Sounds 45 speed 7-inch record from the 60s. And all of that just sort of sets it up for me, the nostalgia of the season. And
then all month that follows, you start putting out these posts might not be any commentary or anything, maybe just the image of all of these very classic 40s, 50s, 60s spooky season images. And you were starting to tell me before we recorded about an archive of some kind where you have seen some of those?
There's like-minded people, out there on Facebook land, and, so there's vintage Halloween images and mid-century stuff. And that's always, Halloween for me is always about, it's a nostalgic season. And
Yes.
I like, that golden age of Halloween in America in the 50s and 60s. And, it was still innocent, but it was still fun. And those are the kind of images I like. And even going back before that, there were lots of postcards and stuff. Those are the images that really, that I really appreciate and enjoy with Halloween. And so I try to, and because, everyone might not be looking at those, I'm looking at them. I'm like, just for anybody that wants to get, I'm trying to help my, my fellows out by getting into the Halloween season, posting those images.
Well, and you talk about Halloween being about nostalgia. There is a feeling that I have around Halloween, and it is the feeling, it's going to sound weird, but I'll explain it. It's the feeling of being both a little bit sweaty and also my cold nose running. And here's why. I think you probably know this. So I grew up in Connecticut, where it actually gets cold by Halloween time. Not so much here in Arkansas, but it cools off a little bit.
If we're lucky.
That was something I had to really adjust to. Like the idea of I could be wearing shorts on Halloween, that was maybe the hardest part of moving south. But I remember walking the streets with my friend Paul Urbanowitz as a little kid. He lived in a neighborhood where there were a lot of these long, straight, flat streets that ended in a cul-de-sac and then came back up to the main street, like all these little branches. And so we'd start at his house with our, bags or pillowcases or whatever. And the houses they all had yards, but they were reasonably close together. And so without having to cover territory that wasn't where any houses were or anything like that, you could just hit house, house, house. And so you'd be wearing that Halloween mask and, feeling kind of the sweat from having that latex over your face or whatever. But then because it was 40 degrees, your nose is cold and it's starting to run a little bit underneath. And to me, that is the feeling of Halloween.
Yeah. And I mean, sweaty and sometimes and stinky, or, in your case, your nose running, but you're not taking that mask off because you're out for trick or treats.
That's right. That's what you're committed to.
Yeah. And I used to, it was just such a fun time. And I remember having a feeling like when it was over, when it was getting towards 8:30, people were starting to turn out their lights, just being, really let down and sad that it was over with. But here's something I would do. I lived in a little neighborhood called Circle Drive, and the drive was a horseshoe.
Okay.
And so lived there all my life. Everyone knew me. But I would go and make my rounds, up one side and down the other. And then I would go home and I would change costumes. And I would get back on my bike and I would go and hit the houses again. And I know the neighbors knew. It's like, even though I had on a different costume, they knew, well, I see his bicycle there. But no one ever called me out on it. They always gave me candy. But that was always, so yeah.
I think I have to respect any kid. Like if I'm the homeowner and I see a kid and I'm like, yeah, I know you. You live literally next door to me. You're not fooling anyone. But you've made the effort to change costumes. Dude, I'm giving you double, triple the candy. That's fine.
I would wring everything out of it I could before it was over.
Well, you were also in a fairly rural area when you grew up.
Yeah.
So I can't imagine. You're from Augusta, Arkansas. Is that how I should say
Yeah,
it?
Augusta. Yeah.
Okay. And how big is that community?
It was when I was a kid, it was probably 2,600, and it's less than that now,
Yeah.
But most of the time I would trick or treat in my neighborhood, but then sometimes me and some of my little friends, we would, Mom would take me uptown and we would, trick or treat there too. But yeah, it was a rural community.
Sure. All right. Next thing I think of when I think of Jake and Halloween, and that is a Halloween mix CD that you made for me years and years ago called It's Halloween. It's Halloween, except it's Hallow apostrophe ween, like in the old classic sense.
Yeah, and that's part of it, that the apostrophe, it was, I guess, All Hallows Evening.
Sure.
In the old vintage ads and postcards and stuff, you'd see that apostrophe there. So that's always my nod to whenever I'm writing out Halloween, on an invitation or on a mix CD, it always put that little nod to the nostalgia.
Well, and when I think of Halloween music, I think most people think of the Monster Mash.
Right.
And we think of some of those novelty songs, but these were some deep cuts, things that I'd never heard of. Some were just sounds of like spooky ghosts or chains rattling and that kind of stuff. So you've got this old vintage jukebox And can we talk about your jukebox Halloween parties? Please, you tell me.
So I got, I was a record collector, kind of like you collect comics. I collected records, and I always wanted a jukebox. And so I found one here in town, and there's a gentleman that used to, work on them and put them in and out of juke joints and stuff. And he had one, and it was 1962 Wurlitzer, and he restored it for me and fixed it up. And I got it, and it was a lot of fun. It was a great piece of Americana, furniture, and it looked like an old car. It had all the chrome and the windshield, and it was done that way to attract, kids in diners because they liked cars. But
it was dope. I've seen the thing. It was so cool.
It's great. So and it was like a 1962, iPod or something. You could put music in. This held 50 records. At Halloween, I was like, oh, well, I'll put some Halloween records in there, because I was always sort of curating, record collections to put in there. And I was like, I'll put some Halloween stuff in there. So of course the Monster Mash and Werewolves of London and Thriller and, things like that. But when I scratched the surface, I realized that, like, in the 50s and 60s, America was obsessed with monsters. I don't know if it was displaced anxieties about the Cold War or what was going on, but there were 2 primetime television shows about monsters. The Addams Family and the Munsters. And so there were all these great records over every genre, from, novelty hits to, like, spooky rockabilly stuff to soul things. I always thought of Michael Jackson's Thriller as sort of sort of a novelty song. And it's just like,
yeah, in a sense,
it's about zombies. But then when I scratched the surface, I realized Michael Jackson probably heard a lot of those old soul, spooky records coming up. And that was maybe his tribute. We'll never know. But I always like to suspect that that's, Thriller didn't just come out of nowhere. There was a history there. But so I collected about 140 Halloween and monster themed records from the 50s and 60s. And so I wanted to show people those, and I wanted to showcase them. So we would always have the Halloween jukebox party, get a keg of beer, pizzas, full-size candy bars. And you were always the first one there, and you were, and I was always say, if you want to wear a costume, because some people don't like, but you'd always be there in costume. And, that bonded me too. I really appreciated that.
And I'll tell you, years ago, Natalie I've talked about her knitting on this show a lot, but she has also gotten into, many years ago, and has done it on and off, some quilting. And so she bought this big, elaborate sewing machine, and I got her one year to make a full life-size costume for me of the blue Grateful Dead dancing bear that I wore one year to your party.
I remember that.
And, I also wore it at Halloween night to pass out candy to the kids. I hadn't thought about what a 6'2" Halloween bear would look like. Yeah. It probably terrified some kids. It's so funny. I made a few notes for myself of just things, Halloween stuff that I wanted to talk to you about. And I actually wrote king-size candy bars as one of the things. Because you advertised it. You're like, this is not some bowl of pretzels on the table party. You would have decorations on every wall in every room in your house.
With Halloween, it's about sort of letting loose and, being the other for that night and not being in the normal trappings. And so, the indulgence that goes along with that is, full-size candy bars. So.
Sure.
And if you want to eat 5 of them, go ahead. That's fine.
I'm sure I did, too. There was one year that you mailed these invitations. You collected everybody's address, even though, of course, we're in the era of text messages. And you mailed these invitations that were a 3-dimensional coffin. And you opened it up inside, and there was a little plastic skeleton in it. Then, like, the date and time of the party, and you're invited. I remember receiving that in the mail at my house and just being so happy.
Yeah, and I always tried to time it because, people's Halloween dance card starts filling up, and, it's usually not on a weekend, so it's either the weekend before. But I always wanted to give people time to prepare if they wanted to, come to So I'd always try to have them ready and mailed out by October, so where they arrived around October 1st, and that was just a little nudge. So it's like, all right, it's that time again. It's spooky season. And so in other years, I would try to send vintage card images and stuff because, Halloween, that was a big part of Halloween, in the early years was Halloween parties back in the first half of last century.
For sure. And I could sit here and just talk Halloween with you all afternoon, but we're right around the 20-minute mark or so in our show, so I guess we probably ought to turn back to our book. And as we get into it, you had some more you wanted to say about the Universal monsters.
thinking about, you know, America's sort of obsession with movie monsters and stuff in the 60s, or not movie, but just monsters and Halloween, I think it could be tied back to some of the Universal monsters. Because a lot of those movies had come out, I mean, between the 30s and the 50s, and they, you know, had their individual monsters, the Wolfman and everything, but Universal, part of what they meant with that, what they wanted with that, is they could exist in each other's universe. And so then, and later on, they started having all of these tie-ins. But, you know, at a point, when television, you know, in the 60s became a big thing, Universal leased the rights to all those movie monster shows to television stations and to be broadcast on television. And so television producers were like, okay, we've got this cool stuff, but we're not going to show these monster movies in prime time. How are we going to do it? And so all across America, they had these properties and they wanted to show them. They thought, you know, we can get viewers out of this, but how do we package it and market it? So what they would do is they would pull like the Weatherman and say, hey, an extra duty is assigned. You're going to be the horror host and you're going to introduce these movies later at night. So there was a whole generation of kids that sort of monster kids that sort of grew up seeing those Universal movies, and they would be, you know, hosted by and introduced by these characters. And they were regional. They were all over the place. Like in Memphis, there was Savad, and it extends into this day. But here in this book, you know, they're showing the film, but they have there one of the old horror hosts.
Yeah, Mr. Owen Oswalt, who was known as Dr. Madness Morbid.
Yeah.
And he's on the stage introducing this movie, God of Monsters, and we'll get there in just a second.
Yeah.
But he's up on the stage, and he's in a wheelchair now, but he still, you can see on his face, even if he was the Weatherman to begin with, he's got all the enthusiasm in the world for these old Basil Saxon movies that he's going to introduce.
And there's a good documentary out there about, you know, where they interview some of these old horror hosts, and, you know, the guy talks about, I was mad when I had to do it. I got called off. It was like, I got this extra duty, but over the years, I came to love it, and that became my, you know, I mean, I was no more for that than being the Weatherman.
Yeah, right. So before we start talking more about the book, one last question I want to ask you, and that is about your history with comics, because unlike a lot of guests that I have on the show, even though you may not be a regular Wednesday Warrior comic book reader now, you've got some history with this subject.
I collected comics, you know, as a kid. I would get them off the rack at the grocery store or whatever. And sometimes if I could make it to a bigger town, Searcy, Arkansas, that you're familiar with.
The big town.
And get comics from a comic book store there. But, you know, I collected for a long time. And then I remember once I wanted some Nintendo games. So I decided I was done with comics, and I sold my entire comic collection, which was pretty substantial to these guys there in Searcy for $100. And I remember them to this day, like sort of grinning at each other. The guy offered me $100, you know, and as a kid, I was like, that was the most money I'd ever, you know.
Sure.
I was like, I can get 4 Nintendo games with that. And so I was like, yeah, done deal, you know. But I remember the guys kind of grinning at each other. But so I got out of comics. But when I was in law school, I felt like I always liked to read for pleasure, but when I was in law school, I felt guilty for reading for pleasure, like a novel or something. I felt like I needed to be reading law. But a friend of mine, Jeremy Hinton, he was really into comics, and he was like, hey, if you want something to read, he was like, take this. And I was like, Jeremy, I'm a grown man. I was like, I'm not really into superheroes. He was like, no, it's more than that. And so he gave me some really great books, and I started reading them, and it was something that I could read for pleasure and sort of take my mind off it at night. And I would read the stories, and, you know, we'd talk about them. He was like, well, what'd you think about the art? And I was like, well, I was kind of just going from word bubble to word bubble, but started paying more attention to the art, and just I really came to appreciate them, because there's things that you can do with them that you can't do with a novel, and that you can't do with a movie or a television show. And they're just a lot of fun. And, you know, this particular imprint, Dark Horse, they had some great anthologies, you know, of spooky stories, and I always like to read those. The Goon was another favorite by Eric Powell.
Yeah, sure.
That I really liked.
You know, I actually didn't know that you had an adult graphic novel apostle of your own years ago.
Yeah, he got me into comic books, and there was a time where Michael Tierney was a local comic purveyor here in town, and I would be at his shop every Wednesday when he opened up to collect my monthly comics, and I did that for years, and I've still got it in storage. I've got bagged and boarded, you know, boxes of like full runs of The Preacher and Constantine, and
oh wow, those Preacher books are probably worth a little something these days. Okay, now it is time to turn to the book, and I have to give a spoiler warning on this. I sometimes forget to do that, but we go through all of the book here on the Graphic Novel Apostle, so if you have heard the solicit so far, you've heard what we've talked about, a little bit about the book and a little bit around the story, and you want to read it, maybe you should go read it before you listen to the rest of this episode. And then come back and listen a second time.
Because there are some twists and turns.
Yeah,
there are some surprise reveals.
There are. So issue 1 of this book, and I mentioned earlier, it's a 4-issue series. The issues do not have individual titles. So issue 1 has an opening page that has a bunch of these old monster movie posters and creature feature type magazines and old movie tickets and stuff like that. And there's an article that is small on the page, like a newspaper article, but you can read the text, and it's worth reading the text because it sets up a lot of what's to come. The article is titled, Lost Film of Local Hero Unearthed. And by the way, this book is set in small town Missouri, in a town called Cedar Bluffs, and that's where all the action is going to take place. But the text of the article reads, responsible for bringing some of the silver screen's most iconic monsters to life, Basil Saxon is a legend among fans of horror and science fiction. He played roles of many terrible creatures for Midnite Studios, and he created the makeup effects for his terrifying performances himself. What would have been his masterpiece, though, is a film that has been lost for decades. Saxon wrote and directed God of Monsters. He also played no less than 6 key roles in the movie. But a disaster on the Midnite Studios set meant the end for the film, until now. A previously unreleased copy of the footage has been discovered, and it will be shown at the Argent Theater in Cedar Bluffs to the delight of film and horror lovers from all over the world.
So I liked the character names here. They were for people that, appreciated or in the know. Basil Saxon. Basil Rathbone was an English actor that played in a lot of those movies, Son of Frankenstein. He was Sherlock Holmes. But then, the note that he played a lot of the different characters is that's a nod to Lon Chaney, the man of 1,000 faces. He did all of his makeup and like Phantom of the Opera. I mean, some of it was, those are some of the best horror roles ever. And then even his son, Lon Chaney Jr., did that. So, I liked the Basil Saxon character was sort of as a nod to Basil Rathbone and, the Lon Chaney.
So once we've read this and we turn into the next page of the book, we've got this flashback to the filming of the movie. So we've got some scenes from the movie, and then we see a fire breaking out on the set. And people are like, there's emergency, what's going on? And they look back at Basil Saxon's director's chair, and he's disappeared. He's not there. There's no evidence of him in his dressing room or anything. And so we know from, of course, this newspaper article from a moment ago, the actual history is Basil disappeared. The film was presumed to have been burned up in the fire, but here we are. A copy of it, at least in some part, has been preserved, and we've got a film festival that's going to take place right here in Cedar Bluffs. Jake, you were telling me a story a few years ago, I remember, about going to was it a documentary film festival down in Hot Springs?
Yeah.
And I've never done one of these like weekend film festival experiences. Tell me just a little bit about what that kind of thing is like, because it sounded awesome.
Yeah, well, I like a documentary a lot. A documentary it's more compelling than actors saying words to me, and they're funny and they can be poignant and sad and but all at the same time and profound. But every year, the Hot Springs Documentary Film Festival, and they're going on 20 plus years. It runs for 2 weeks. And I always try to take a weekend and go down. It's at the Arlington Hotel. It's an old hotel there. And I'll, get a room on the second floor, and I'll just spend all weekend, watching docs. They have 2 theaters, and you go, I always come away with very memorable films. But it's just it's a great way to spend a weekend. And a lot of times the filmmakers there, and you can talk to them, but it's actually coming up here in October. But I get busy with life and sometimes can't make it. But I look forward to the day when I retire, and I'm going to go spend the entire 2 weeks just lounging in Hot Springs and watching documentaries and eating good food and, soaking up the atmosphere.
That is awesome. You mentioned people involved with the films, filmmakers or whatever being there. In this case, we've got Mr. Owen Oswalt, a.k.a. Dr. Madness Morbid, the old local television station horror host who's going to introduce this, and you can tell, he's just happy about being there to do this.
Yeah. And he's one of the guys, I can tell from the character, he's one of those guys who was, he spent so many years introducing those movies and watching them, it became a part, and he was steeped in the lore of the movies, and so he's a good person to have there at the fest to talk about this sort of holy grail film that was lost.
Oh, for sure. So most of this issue is dedicated to really introducing us to what's going to be our core cast of characters, or maybe our monster squad, you might even think of it as well as bringing in the monsters to our real life. And let's just talk about that a little bit. So in the audience, as the film is starting, you've got a guy named Jason, and he's like a horror nut. He is so excited that this is going to happen right now.
And
he can't believe he's
and
part
as
of
usual,
this.
his companion is not such a horror fan.
Right, his girlfriend.
Is bewildered by his excitement over it.
Her name is Connie, and she is along for the ride, but you can tell she's not enthusiastic about it. And then out in the lobby while this film is starting, you've got a couple of theater employees, Buddy and Trina, and they're kind of having a little bit of a flirtation going on. You can tell there's some mutual affection there. You've got a young woman named Grace. She's a horror fan and also like a social media influencer.
A streamer. She's out there in the lobby holding up her phone, and she's live streaming, her discussion of what she's about to go in and see. And then at a kind of a sad table in the corner of the theater lobby, you've got Abigail Jenner. She is a retired B-movie actress. And when I say retired, I don't mean that she's in her 70s or something like that, but you can tell she's probably not making these movies anymore. She's probably kind of on this film festival horror convention circuit. Yeah, she's there signing autographs, not exactly what she'd like to be doing. She'd rather be making horror movies still.
I think she does not have the same level of enthusiasm as Dr. Madness Morgan does.
And the other festival goers know.
But outside the theater, there are some odd things that are happening in the world. We see this couple, and we're never given their names, but they're just guy and a girl, look like they're in their 20s, out for a walk in the park. They're talking about, we just had a good dinner or whatever. And the panels, you get sort of interspersed back and forth. The panel of them walking in the park with the panel of something else happening.
Well, the something else that's happening is a throwback to Lon Chaney Jr.'s 1941, The Wolf Man, where they're hunting him in the woods after he's turned, and it's that scene from the movie is a throwback to that you have juxtaposed with the man and the woman, walking in the park, so the werewolf is my favorite movie monster. Like, I like the werewolf better than any other monster. And my favorite scary movie, and maybe favorite horror movie, and maybe even favorite movie period, is An American Werewolf in London.
Yeah.
There's a scene in that where there's a young couple in the park that gets attacked by the werewolf. So it wasn't on all fours with that, pardon the pun, but it was it reminded me of that.
Oh, sure.
That scene from American Werewolf in London.
Cullen Bunn is a huge horror guy. Actually, he's known within comics as the king of horror. Most of his books end up being horror books, although he writes in other genres as well. And so I have a feeling that a lot of these things you're seeing were very intentional.
Yeah, no, there's no doubt about it. And you could tell it made it fun because those were little Easter eggs, for people that did appreciate it. And, and I was wondering, it's like, how much of this stuff how many Easter eggs did he put in here that I'm not picking up? So, which I really appreciated.
Sure.
But yeah, you could tell that he was steeped in the lore of it, and he really appreciated it.
And a cool way that we see these two worlds start blending together is as this couple is walking in the park, all of a sudden, like, this big fog starts coming up all around them, and they're noticing it. They're like, this is weird. Why is it all foggy? And of course, we'd seen in the previous panel that these guys out on the moors that were hunting the werewolf were, moors are foggy. That's right. That's what they are. And so this comes together. And tell me about your reaction when we first see one of these monsters enter the world.
It's fun and it's gruesome, and it's why I love the werewolf, because, the vampire, he's an aristocrat, and he'll try to seduce you and then poke 2 holes in your neck, and that's it. But the werewolf will jump out of the bushes and sever your head with a swipe, and that's exactly what happens to the poor gentleman in this panel.
Guys, this comic book is no holds barred. The art is in a cartoony kind of style. I would not be concerned about Garrett, looking at all the images on these pages. In fact, I showed him some of the fish man tearing a guy in half later on, the Dweller. But yeah, if you thought that you weren't going to see any of the gore on panel here, that werewolf takes a swipe and decapitates the man in this couple, and you just see his bloody head rolling off. So next we see like some skater kids, and they're walking into a grocery store like they're going to get some snacks or something. And all of a sudden they see some like sand that just starts appearing in the aisle, and they're like, what is this all about? And we're introduced to the mummy.
Yeah.
And the mummy in this iteration is wearing like a jackal mask, like a black mask.
Yeah, Anubis.
So this is the Anubis mask.
That's a symbol of Egypt, and I think he was the god of death, maybe. And there's a later interplay here with this. They make a note about the creature from the Black Lagoon, he's an eldritch horror. And then later when him and the mummy are fighting, the mummy's like, you're no god, I'm a god. You know? Anyway, so is that Anubis? Anubis? Is that,
Anubis,
that's how you
I
say
believe
it?
so.
Yeah, that's probably how you pronounce it. I've always read it, never pronounced it. But.
Okay, cool. So he's got the Anubis mask. He's got 2 like jackals with him, and usually we just think of the mummy as no mask, just wrapped completely in the wraps. And he's got the wrappings, but he's out there next, and he's going to grab one of these skater kids by the head and just like melt him to sand.
Yeah, and his dogs are tearing faces and.
Next one, and this is my favorite of these introductions. You have these older guys, and they're out fishing. And it's just, 3 older men sitting around fishing. They're talking about things they've caught. And then all of a sudden, one of them is like, oh, I've got something big on the line. I got something big. And the dweller jumps up out of the water and just starts eating the guy. Terrifying, but so fun. I never saw The Creature from the Black Lagoon.
Yeah, 1954. It was one of the later. It was still a Universal horror movie, but it was a later edition.
The last couple of years, Peacock has had a lot of those Universal horror movies, and I haven't checked to see if they've got them this October or not. But they had a nice, like, a little section where it was like Universal Monsters Collection, and I try every year to watch some of that.
Well, and there's some, Marvel has success with its universe, and so there's been, some feeling that Universal wants to try to, set up a universe where they can spin out monster movies like, in days of old and connect all the universes. And so there's, they've attempted some of that. And as a matter of fact, in January of this year, The Wolfman, they're doing a remake of The Wolfman.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
So as we sit here in the fall of 2024, over the last, I guess, 6 months maybe, I can't remember which comic book company it is right now. I think it's Image and Skybound have been releasing, as I understand it, in conjunction with Universal, these miniseries on, the first one was a Dracula miniseries, and there was one on The Creature from the Black Lagoon. And I was hoping that the werewolf one would come out by the time we got to do this, but it hasn't hit the stands yet.
But there's definitely a movement afoot to resurrect these monsters.
So Frankenstein is next. And Frankenstein's monster shows up in an appliance or an electronics store, something like a Best Buy, basically. And he's going to knock the head right off of a night watchman. When we see Frankenstein later, we'll see he's carrying around like all these like car batteries and different electronics.
He's got to keep himself charged up.
Keeping him juiced up. So I guess that was a good place to land. But then, as with any great comic, you get your last page reveal. We turn to the last page of issue 1. And it's the film projectionist back at the Argent Theater. And he's just talking to himself and eating popcorn. And he's talking about how vampires are the easiest to kill. And then right behind him appears Dracula.
Yeah, he made the same mistake that I did, like underestimating Dracula. It's like, Dracula's no big deal. He just pokes 2 holes in your neck. But he's soon disabused of that notion.
He certainly will be. And that carries us straight into issue 2. And issue 2 opens inside the audience area of the Argent Theater. And there's this swarm of bats that just comes into the theater. I'm going to presume out of the projectionist booth. And the crowd all starts rushing out in a panic. People are getting trampled. And in the midst of it, Dracula starts showing up and biting people too. And so it's not just bats.
Good old Dr. Morbid, Madness Morbid, he knows what's coming. He says, this is just like Dracula in the Reign of Blood movie.
Yeah, Dr. Morbid ends up being somebody who, for a little while at least, really helps us sort of find our way into what is occurring. If anything was unclear on the page, he is connecting any dots for us. Although I think you can pretty well follow it with just the art. But he is bringing in some things that are a little more specific, like when the world starts changing, and we'll talk about this in a minute, where our Monster Squad core cast all finds themselves together out on the street. The streets look different than they're used to seeing them. They're like, this isn't Cedar Bluffs.
They slowly have the realization that this is the movies come to life.
Yeah, and
everything that goes along with that.
That's exactly right.
Monsters.
Including the sets, including the monsters, and all of that. And so, let's just go there. So this core cast all gets together and they assemble outside the theater. And as they start to realize they're on what looks like the set of one of Basil Saxon's old horror films, and in addition to Dr. Morbid, Jason, the horror movie buff character.
Jason, the name.
Of course, like Jason Voorhees, sure.
He's outside that universe, but still.
Yep. Is also sort of picking up on, like, he and and Dr. Morbid are kind of feeding off of each other, like, no, that's not from this movie, that's from this other movie, which is kind of part of the fun. But the werewolf, which I think is appropriate for us to start referring to as the Necro Wolf,
Yes.
attacks. And if you thought that it was just going to be people walking in the park or skateboarders, who show up for 2 or 3 panels in the grocery store that are going to get killed by these monsters, our core cast is a little bigger than you might have with 3 or 4 people, probably because they are not immune.
No.
And the Necro Wolf comes up to Trina. She was the female movie theater employee, and literally rips her face off of her skull.
I know. I was surprised, and it was great because the panel, I was surprised by that, and the panel of the other companions, their faces were surprised too. That was a good panel of look of surprise, and I was like, Trina was the kind soul. I hated to see Trina go like that.
I did too, and I'll tell you who especially hated to see Trina go like that was Buddy, the guy she was flirting with from the movie theater, her coworker, and he's going to want some revenge later that's not going to turn out well for him probably. You mentioned how this appears on the page where you see the surprise of the other characters in the cast. We always put up a couple of pages of sample art from the books on our Instagram account, which is @GraphicNovelApostle, and we'll do that here as well. This time, at least 4 of the images I put up, though, are going to be from the covers that Brian Hurtt did for this series, because those covers are really good.
Yeah, the alternate covers were pretty great.
Well, and because I was looking through, and I don't even mean alternate covers.
Oh.
I'm talking about the main covers. You probably have them somewhere in the back.
Right, no, the single panel splash page is sort of, great.
And for listeners who see these images up there, you'll see that my issues 1 and 4, which I thought were, issue 1 is issue 1, and then issue 4 I thought had the best cover of them all. I both got them signed by Cullen Bunn, and I'm pretty proud of that. I'm hoping that at one of these comic conventions I get to, I can find Brian Hurtt as well and get him to sign them also, because, man, I thought this series was so cool. So to further move us along a little bit with what's happening, Mr. Oswalt, or Dr. Morbid, actually starts monologuing a little bit about that God of Monsters film that they were showing in the theater, and how there was always this rumor that that film was haunted by a curse of some kind. And he is surmising now that playing the movie summoned all of these movie monsters into our world in our time. And of course, he's exactly right. While he's doing this monologue, it's showing scenes from those old movies, and Mr. Oswalt is sort of like narrating what's happening. Well, while our cast is out here on the street, there's a sandstorm that comes up and is swirling like a character coming through a dimension portal or something like that. The mummy comes walking through this swirling sand, and he stretches out his hand toward Dr. Morbid, who starts to shrivel up and die, and he's going to melt into nothing but a pile of bones and sand. And I thought this was a really cool idea here. First of all, I was actually shocked the first time I read this that they killed this character off.
Yeah.
I thought he'd be one that maybe he dies like last panel, last issue, but he's getting killed off here in issue 2 of 4. But what I thought was so cool about this was when he sees the mummy coming through, he recognizes it's my time now. And I always knew that it would be this monster that took me, because he's the old man now.
Yeah, and I liked he was like, old age is the scariest monster of all, and it's coming for all of us, and I knew it was coming for me.
That's right, in the form of the ancient mummy character.
Right.
I love that.
Yeah, no, that was good.
Well, we don't really have much time to mourn for Dr. Morbid, because Frankenstein appears out of nowhere, and he starts fighting the mummy. And the remaining members of our core cast that haven't been killed yet all flee, and they're starting to get away, and we turn over and we get this last page reveal as the cast runs into somebody who maybe brings a ray of hope into our life here. Dr. Abraham Van Helsing, who has come to save the world.
And this probably isn't a connection, but in some of these old, novelty songs and monster songs, the monsters are always fighting. They're having a party and the monsters get into a fight. And I was like, look, the monsters are, this is in keeping with that. They're fighting.
Well, that's really cool. Yeah, that is a fun little connection. All right, so we get into issue 3, and I want to note for readers now that, if we got anybody out there who are comics people who like to, go dig through back issue bins, and of course, this book is just a year old, but it's going to be out there in some back issue bins. Issue 3 is the most exciting issue of this series.
It is. So going back just a second, so one of the fun things that I did a double take on is when Van Helsing is introduced, Jason, the horror movie fan, he was like, "Oh, Basil Saxon," and he was like, "No, I'm Van Helsing." And he was like, "I thought I recognized you as Basil Saxon."
Well, that's right. And, remember, we'd gotten from that article very early on that Basil Saxon played a bunch of the characters in his movies. And so, you do wonder, is there any separation between any one of these characters and the embodiment of Basil Saxon?
Right, because he played them all in the movies.
I'm glad you mentioned that. Yeah, that's a fun little nugget.
So, I did a double take there, but then I moved on.
So going into this issue 3, if what you're here for is monster fighting, you're going to get it here. Because just like in Jake's old novelty songs, these monsters are fighting. You see that, I think this is one of the most clever of the novelty t-shirts that says, "Surely not everyone was kung fu fighting." Well, here, if you're a universal monster, you are fighting, and that's everyone.
Yeah, an example of the monsters fighting, there's a great song called "The Mummy's Ball" by The Verdicts, and the monsters are reeling and rocking and fighting all night long, and it's great.
And we paused for just a second, and you played a little of that for me. It's like a doo-wop song, basically.
Yeah, it was from back then.
And it sounds like everything was going well until someone stepped on the mummy's wrappings.
Yeah.
And I guess
it was Frankenstein.
Okay. And I'm going to make a pun because I'm a dad. I guess things unraveled from there.
Yes.
And folks, if Instagram has that among the songs that you can choose from to put over your Instagram posts, I will put that one on the post related to this episode. So as we open issue 3, we have a scene from God of Monsters that's playing on the panel, I guess, where Dracula attempts some kind of ritual, and it's one that Van Helsing actually interrupts. And we learn that this ritual requires the essence of all of the 5 monsters somehow, in order for one of the monsters, whoever completes the ritual, to become the God of Monsters. And Van Helsing is explaining this. We're seeing it in scenes from the movie God of Monsters, but Van Helsing in real time is also explaining this to our core cast that's remaining.
And whoever completes the ritual is the personification of malevolence and have dominion over all creatures of the night.
Right.
So that's the goal for the monsters.
But it also helps us better understand why these monsters are fighting each other. Sometimes we think of those monsters as they're all here to attack us, the citizenry. But no, they've got as much conflict among themselves, maybe more than they've got with anybody here.
And one of the companions says to Van Helsing, "Well, I'm glad you're here to help us out because you have the tools to kill them all." He's like, "But we can let them kill each other." He's like, "We can let them fight each other. That's the strategy."
Well, that's exactly right.
Because he was like, "It's very dangerous."
Yeah. Believe it or not, killing monsters is dangerous. And who's going to be more effective? Who's more powerful? Van Helsing with his crossbow? Or is it going to be the Dweller as he tries to attack the werewolf?
And so they set out to go back to the theater because they have to stop Dracula from performing the ritual, because in their mind that's who's trying to be the god of monsters.
That's right.
But before they can do that, the street floods, just like the sand appeared in the convenience store. The street floods, and they're just like, "What's going on here?"
And the Dweller attacks.
And he chomps on a policeman, and he chomps on a random citizen.
I do love that there are characters that are introduced. They might get a line, they might not, but for no reason other than to be fodder for our monsters. And our crew, knows that they have to escape immediately. So they're going to rush into this bar. And they know the bar. It's a local bar. In fact, I think Connie says to Jason, "Hey, this is where we went on our second date," or something like that. But it's not the bar anymore.
It starts changing. It's
become a tavern. And I ought to let you talk about this tavern and what we find there, because this is your territory.
Yeah, well, so in my favorite movie, An American Werewolf in London, the poor innocents come into a tavern and the locals are, but then that's where the werewolf appears soon after that. So I like that callback. And not too long, here comes the Necro Wolf.
That's right. So the Necro Wolf attacks, and while our heroes thought that they were going to find some safety inside, they're running right back out to the streets that they were just fleeing from, because I don't know. I guess they're like, well, the immediate threat right now is the Necro Wolf, not the Dweller.
And I like that Van Helsing goes to shoot the Necro Wolf. And he apologizes and he says, I have pity on you because, Dracula's Dracula and the mummy's a bad guy, but the werewolf, it's a curse. And he, the man that's underneath may not can help it. John Landis, who did An American Werewolf in London, he always said the werewolf was the saddest character because he was like, it's like he has cancer, but instead of killing him, it kills everyone around him.
Yeah.
So sympathy for the werewolf. So Van Helsing does have a little sympathy for the werewolf, but who doesn't have sympathy for the werewolf is Buddy. He pushes Van Helsing aside and starts blasting him with a shotgun. And I'm reading it, I was like, okay, he doesn't have silver bullets in the shotgun, but like that werewolf looks kind of done. Is it, what's going to happen?
Yeah, it does look kind of done, and probably very foolish on the part of Buddy, because I get he's in a rage over his love interest having been killed by the Necro Wolf, but Van Helsing, I think, said something about having a silver bullet in his gun.
Yeah.
And he gets pushed out of the way. And then this jumps back to me and my guy, because poor Buddy has taken these shots at the werewolf and he thinks the werewolf is down. And then we turn the page and all of a sudden the Dweller pops out from under the water that has started to flood the streets. And he grabs Buddy, one end from his top and one end from his legs, and he just rips him in half at the waist.
Yep. Into,
and there are guts and blood everywhere.
So long, Buddy.
Yeah, that's right. And it's at this point, though, that the Dweller has spotted the Necro Wolf, who, by the way, when our characters ran out of the bar, the Necro Wolf, dove through the window.
Right. He's not using a
glass
door.
Everywhere. No. This is a
He's
beast.
a brute. He's a brute.
That's right. It turns out the Necro Wolf is not dead from these shotgun blasts, and the Dweller has spotted him, and he spotted the Dweller, and these two are going to go at it, and we have a sick monster fight that goes on for a couple of pages.
Yeah. Yeah, and I like how it splashed across the both pages. That was fun.
Yeah, for sure. And you talked about the werewolf being the saddest of the creatures, and it looked like the werewolf was down a minute ago from the shotgun blasts. When we end this monster fight, it appears that the Dweller has drowned.
He's being drowned. Yeah, I was like, that's clever. I was like, does that work better than silver? Maybe. He's got to breathe there.
Here's your spoiler, though. He'll be back. So apparently, Necro Wolf's very hard to kill.
So, and I like here, so while they're fighting, Frankenstein appears. He wants Van Helsing's help to find the ritual's, source, the ritual, what's the spell? Where can I find the spell to, do this, to bring about the god of monsters? And Van Helsing refuses, and he shoots Frankenstein. But then after that, inexplicably, he appears, Frankenstein doesn't harm him or make a move towards him, but Van Helsing appears to fall ill, like he is having a heart attack or something.
That's right. Well,
and Frankenstein calls him a fool.
Yeah. So he shoots Frankenstein basically in the chest. And right after this shot, he starts grabbing his own chest, and the people around him think he's having a heart attack. And we don't know exactly what's going on, but we have a hint here. We have a hint that there is some sort of connection in life force, maybe, between Van Helsing and these monsters, which also makes sense in going back to our idea that Basil Saxon played all of these characters.
Yeah, and that again caused me to do a double take, but I thought about it for a second and then moved on.
Well, we don't get to stay here very long either, because the mummy appears out of nowhere, and he's going to start fighting Frankenstein, and we've got more monster fight going on. And in the thick of all that, we turn the page, we get a great last page reveal once again, and it's Dracula. He's exiting the Argent Theater, which apparently they're still on the same street of. And he's got some of those audience members with him that he has turned into vampires.
And he's got the theater manager, Reggie. When I saw, I was like, oh, Reggie's still here.
Yeah, I thought Reggie had been killed.
I was like, I wonder if Reggie is a vampire now. And sure enough, in the next panel, you see his teeth. He's been turned into a minion of Dracula.
That's right.
Poor old Reggie.
And some of those minions of Dracula are carrying those old canisters, the metal film reel canisters, and they've got the reels from the god of monsters. And Dracula says that it's time for him to complete the ritual and for him to ascend to be the god of monsters. And that takes us out of issue 3 and into the last issue of this miniseries.
And so then that begins with sort of a quick recap of all the monster contenders for, God of Monster.
Yeah, that opening to issue 4 is really cool, how each monster gets their own panel and their own sort of description about why they're terrifying. And Van Helsing is reminding us in that moment as well of why these monsters are in conflict. And we've already discussed it. Only one of them can be the god of monsters, but it's a good reminder. And that produces a big monster fight with all of the monsters going at it. And as this fight gets going, the Necro Wolf, I mean, he decapitates one of these newly turned vampires.
Again.
Yet another decapitation at the hands of the Necro Wolf. But this newly turned vampire, when he gets his head knocked off, he drops the film reel that he has in his hand, and it starts to roll away. And Dracula sees this, and he turns, and he yells, "The ritual!" And that sort of gives the game away.
Yeah, Dracula's concern over that is a tip-off for the companions about the film is significant after all.
Right. And while the cast of characters that we're hoping will survive has been kind of sitting back and just letting this fight unfold, realizing their best bet, like Van Helsing had advised them, was to let them all kill each other, they now have to get involved because they realize it's going to be an out-and-out chase for these reels. And, you know, like you always have multiple reels that would make up those old films. Apparently, in this case, there are 5 reels, and each one of these 5 reels contains the essence of at least one of these monsters.
The essence necessary for the ritual.
That's right.
So the monsters are all inextricably linked to the film reels.
And our heroes are able to, in this squabble, steal 2 of those film reels, and they flee. They run off, and they go to this, like, empty warehouse. And they think maybe they're safe there for just a moment.
But it morphs into Dracula's living room.
That's right.
The living room of his castle.
That's exactly
right.
right.
Is where our beleaguered companions find themselves.
And we're not alone for long either, because what would be in Dracula's living room except Dracula and his frenemies?
Yeah, the monsters converge.
That's right. The monsters converge. They all arrive, and they say, you know, look, I think Dracula's the one who tells us this, that, yeah, we all want to kill each other in battle for supremacy, but we're smart enough to know that we've got to defeat you guys too. And so now it is the monsters united against our...
Yeah, the mummy says, we can put our differences aside when circumstances demand.
Oh, there we go. Okay, so it was the mummy who was telling us, not Dracula.
I appreciate that sentiment, putting differences aside when circumstances demand.
Absolutely.
So the monsters aren't completely unreasonable.
No. And in kind of a quick move here, one of our hero characters, Jason, removes one of the reels from its can, and he picks up this candle, and he destroys the reel destroys the film from the reel with the candle flame.
So yeah, after the mummy announces it's us versus y'all now, the Necro Wolf makes a move for Jason, and Jason's just like, you know, wait a minute. He was like, I'll burn this film reel that y'all need so bad.
Turns out it's good that he has the one that he has, because it is the Necro Wolf who is the subject of this particular film reel. And so the Necro Wolf bursts into flames.
Yep, goes up in flames. His essence, that's him. He doesn't exist outside of that reel.
And it kills him right in front of us.
And so our companions, they're only holding two of the 5 reels, but they know they've got some leverage now.
Yeah, so Abigail, our B-movie actress, pulls out the second reel, or she has the second reel, and she pulls the film out of its canister. And she's sort of playing like a roulette game with them, in the sense that she's got this lighter she's flicking, and
she's
says,
like, which one of you is it going to be?
You know, I don't know which one of you is
do
is
y'all
on this
want to
reel.
find out?
And this is such a good turn. Abigail says to them, basically, are you ready to play your odds? You've got a 1 in 4 chance of being the one who's going to get destroyed. And Dracula says to her, 5. And that's, you know, confusing. We hesitate for a minute because there are 4 monsters. One has just been burned to death. She says you got a 1 in 4 chance, and Dracula says
there are 5 monsters, and then one of them's now gone.
Correct.
And so it's just like 1 in 5 chance, and they, you know, there's some confusion there among the companions.
Abigail has this like confused look on her face. All of a sudden, a wooden stake comes through the back of her neck and straight out her throat. And of course, who's standing behind her but Van Helsing?
Yeah, with his mallet and wooden stake.
So Jason attacks Van Helsing at this point, because now it's like, all right, we just got to get into a fight. We got to see what can happen. And in the course of this fight, some of the characters are like knocked back into like this candelabra.
Yeah, well, Jason, he lunges at Van Helsing and knocks him into a candelabra, knocks the candelabra over.
That's right. And somehow, as everybody sort of dogpiles all the monsters and everything else, although I'll say Connie, Jason's girlfriend, and Grace, the social media influencer, are kind of fleeing out the door. And I think Jason was really trying to cover for them, to protect them.
Yeah, because Connie at that point, she was like, all right, I'm done. I'm out. I don't want to be here anymore. And Jason's like, I'm not going to let anything happen to you.
And in the course of that fight, the reels are all burned up. And as a result, our monsters are all burned up along with them. And so poor Connie and Grace, who are now out on the streets, because Jason had been burned up in this fire as well, they are the only two remaining from our cast of heroes. And they're walking back toward the theater, and there are dead bodies everywhere on the streets of Cedar Bluffs.
We see Buddy and Twain again.
Yeah, we sure do. We see Buddy here, we see Buddy there. But at least they can let out a sigh of relief that the threat is gone.
Yeah, the sacrifice is worth it. It's finished now. The reels don't exist anymore, so the ritual can't exist anymore. The essence doesn't exist anymore.
That's right. The movie's gone. Except that's when Grace has this oh shoot moment, and she has a realization that she's going to tell us.
That she was streaming the movie when they were at the Argent Theater.
At the beginning, before all those bats flew in and attacked everybody. This is why you're not supposed to do movie piracy, guys.
Yeah.
This is what you don't take your phone and film the movie. But she'd been live streaming it and putting it up on the internet. And so we turn over and we've got another great last page reveal. Although this time it's not like a big splash page with just one character. Instead, we see some people that we have not seen before. And it's just a bunch of dudes who are like video chatting on their different computers. And one of them is talking about the movie The God of Monsters and how he's been following Grace's stream. And it shows on his computer screen that he's watching The God of Monsters. And the other guys who are chatting with him are like, is someone in the room with you? Who's behind you? Who's that?
The dangers of social media. It's Dracula.
It is. And Dracula is behind him. And then in our very last panel, where sometimes we get fiend or conclusion or whatever, here.
The end, ? With Dracula looming.
Oh, man. So I don't know whether there's any plan for another volume of this or not. I love that Cullen Bunn left it open so that there could be.
Yeah, and it's in keeping with the fact that these universal monsters are really universal. They can exist forever. They can be brought back like the Wolfman's coming back in January of 2025.
Okay, so we have gotten through the book. And I told you before we started recording, because I usually like to do as little as I can in talking to my guests about the book or what we're going to talk about on the podcast. But I wanted to give you some time to think about this one first. So I told you I was going to ask this question. It's Halloween time. What is, I'm going to say the best, but understand your favorite or what means the most to you. What is the best piece of Halloween season media?
Yeah, well, that was one reason I enjoyed this book, because I think it's print media, and what's fun is these images that are spooky and scary and just bring the season to the fore. I like to be able to linger over them and look at them and look at the details. And that's what's great about these comic books. But in the past, a lot of the trade advertisements, back in the 50s and 60s that focused on Halloween, and those images are great. And then before that, there were postcards and even the decorations, the paper decorations. There was a company called Bastille they were purveyors of, great paper Halloween decorations. And so those images that I can, linger over, those are the print media is my favorite,
That's
Halloween.
Awesome. Yeah.
And the comics are part and parcel with that.
I love that.
And that's what made this book so fun, is just going and checking out those images of the werewolf and monsters creating mayhem and spooky stuff.
That's so cool. And maybe a little less sophisticated, but I got to tell you, mine for Halloween, best piece of Halloween season media of all, is the Garfield Halloween special.
Oh, yes. I along with Great Pumpkin, I watch that Garfield every year.
I watch the Garfield every year, and I've gotten Garrett into it to where he looks forward to watching it.
And even the Garfield has a thing where it's like, it's late at night, Halloween's over, nobody's trick-or-treating anymore. But watching it would always produce that same sort of feeling in me. It's just like, because they're there at the end, late that night after Halloween's over, and they're watching the television, and it comes back to them. What they went through.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, the old man shows up on television.
Yeah.
That's right.
But it's sort of that, it would always produce that same feeling in me. It's just like, oh man, it's over. It's done. Got to wait till next year.
And then before we end this, I also have to shout out the Legend of Sleepy Hollow cartoon The Ichabod Crane
yeah,
cartoon. That was an every year for me as a kid, one I had to see. All right. I think we've talked plenty of Halloween. We've talked plenty of the Midnite Show. Jake, I had so much fun doing this today.
Yeah, this was great.
And I'll tell you, man, I guess it's been more than a decade that we haven't worked together. We just don't get to see each other as much.
Yeah,
And
life gets in the way.
Oh, it does. We both have families. We both have busy schedules. I am so happy that we got to hang out this morning. We're recording this on the Saturday morning before this episode will be released. And, man, it's been a great day.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me over and just having a good conversation and talk about things that we love about Halloween and spooky season and scary stuff. This made my day.
Well, there was no better guest I could have asked. Jake, thank you so much. And to everybody out there listening, I will look forward to seeing you guys back here next Monday for another one of our mini episodes where we're going to stick with the horror and Halloween type theme. That'll be just me as a solo episode. But until then, keep reading those comics.